Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first Screencast-O-Matic that I have created as the instructor and not as a graduate student. So fingers crossed that everything goes well. So as you can see on the screen right now, I have the outline for what we would have done in class had we been meeting tonight. So I want to start off by explaining what the difference between a summary and a synthesis is. And you should be familiar with both of these terms and probably the difference between these two terms from Comp 1, but I feel like it bears repeating. So the key difference here is that when you create a summary of a text, you focus on one text at a time. And in that summary, you then just give an overview of what the main arguments are in that single text. There's no relationship to any other text. You solely focus on that one piece of writing, as if you were creating an overview of it for someone who's never read it before. Whereas in a synthesis, like your critical engagement assignments, you're focusing on what is the relationship between multiple sources, which means that you need at least two sources at a time in order to have a synthesis, which kind of goes without saying, but nonetheless, I said it. So whenever you're doing a synthesis, however you're doing it, whether it be in paragraph form or in the form of a graphic organizer, whatever you need to do, your synthesis needs to focus on what are the common themes among 2, 3, or more of your sources. And your discussion of how those sources all talk about that common theme forms the basis of that synthesis. So, moving on from that, what we need to understand is that in APA research style papers, typically synthesis gets called a literature review. And literature reviews can take multiple different forms. They can be a standalone document, they can be an introductory section to the rest of your paper, what have you. So for this particular assignment, which is really going to be your first major writing assignment of the semester, this literature review is going to be a standalone assignment that kind of gestures towards the kinds of writing you're going to do throughout the rest of the semester. Okay, so I'm going to transition to the presentation that I created that I would have showed you in tonight's class. All right, so literature reviews. What are they? Why are we doing one? So although a literature review contains some elements of summary writing, it goes beyond merely summarizing the content of the sources under consideration, because if you only summarize them, you would really be just doing multiple summaries. Its main focus is on critically analyzing and synthesizing the relationships or common themes among your sources. And as you were all supposed to do on Sunday, or by 5 p.m. on Sunday, you had to find at least 8 different sources about your general research topic. I have not gotten to those sources yet in your Google Drive folders. I'll be doing that later tonight, so stay tuned. But put another way, a literature review is a more professional version of the critical engagement assignments you completed in College Composition 1. So although we're giving it a new name, the general purpose behind it should be very similar to things you've done in the past. All right, so why are you writing one? Contrary to what you may think, I'm not requiring you to write a literature review just to make you miserable. A literature review really should help you establish your knowledge and your credibility on the topic you chose and the related research questions you're considering or pursuing. So this is your opportunity to show me how much you've learned in this little bit of time since you started doing your research. So am I expecting you to be an absolute expert at this point? Definitely not. But do I expect you to have more knowledge of your topic than I do? Yes. Additionally, the literature review also constructs a solid foundation or background on which to build your future research argumentative essays. So if you look at the syllabus, you'll be doing 2 major argumentative essays, and they all come back to the types of sources that you found earlier in the semester. Fine. So how do we write one? You're on board with me because you feel like you have to be. That's okay. So your first step is to closely reread, annotate, and take notes on the sources you found thus far. So I didn't really establish any guidelines in terms of what you were supposed to do with the sources you put in your Google Drive folders just yet. But I'm hoping that you've at least read through most of them, whether it be skimming or intense reading. So at this point, if you haven't read them all, you want to make sure you spend some time reading them, annotating them, taking notes. What I would suggest is maybe creating a Google Doc. That way you have all of your notes on all of your sources in one place. And typically what I'll do is just type the author's name and the title of each source, and then do a bulleted list of quotations from that source, and then just keep doing that for every source. If you don't like that method or you have a different one in mind, feel free. I'm never going to grade that necessarily, but it will help you. So to help you organize your notes, what I've done is created a synthesis matrix for you. So I'm not going to grade your notes necessarily, but I will grade this synthesis matrix. And I'll discuss that in a separate screencast that you'll be watching for tonight's session, so stay tuned. As you complete step 1, you may notice that certain sources just do not fit with some of the others. That's okay. You'll just want to do 2 things. You'll want to temporarily replace them with additional sources that share commonalities, so meaning that another source that relates to one of the ones you've already found. That way you don't stress yourself out when you fill in the matrix later on. But I recommend saving every source that you have just in case, because you never know what you'll need later on. And you don't want to have to go back and find all those sources all over again. Then what? So you've completed your synthesis matrix, which again we'll talk about later. You'll want to start planning the structure of the literature review, which will be in essay format and around 1,000 words. When I say around, I mean pretty much that should be your minimum amount of words. Anything less than that might not be as detailed as you might need it to be or as I might want it to be. So we're going to shoot for 1,000 words, especially since I've changed kind of the nature of this assignment since I printed the syllabus. So if you see something that said 750 words minimum, I would say we're going to shoot more towards the 1,000 word minimum, okay? Your literature review should begin with an introductory paragraph that briefly explains how you located and chose the sources and the common themes you will discuss throughout the review. So it shouldn't be too much different than the introductory paragraphs you've written before, especially because you'll be able to use I, but I will expect you to use what we call academic I. So keeping all those thoughts and feelings out of it, kind of like how you use the academic I in your research proposals, okay? So what happens after we write the intros that you might not be super happy with? You'll write a series of body paragraphs, each of which begins with a topic sentence that clearly articulates one of the 4 common themes you will discuss. So it's going to tell me exactly something like research shows how X, Y, or Z. Something like that. It doesn't have to be super fancy. Each paragraph should then synthesize ideas from at least 3 sources using paraphrases, or short quotations from each source to support the theme under consideration. When you introduce a source, mention the author's last names and the years of publication. So I have it here as an example. Garber, in parentheses 2019, discusses how ... So each time you introduce an author, you want to make sure you're following this format. Their last name and the year that it was published, okay? And if we paraphrase, we don't need to cite, right? No. Make sure that you're always citing. Although a paraphrase translates a source's ideas into your own words, the ideas still belong to that source, so you must include a proper in-text citation. You can find tips for creating the in-text citations on your How to Cite Common Sources in APA handout from last class. I also have that under the Research and Literature Review content folder on Blackboard. And here's a basic reminder right down there for you. So it distinguishes between paraphrase and direct quote. If you have a source that does not have page numbers, then obviously you would just not put the page number, okay? And I'll obviously be able to tell it's a direct quote because you have the quotation marks, okay? So what else should we do or not do in the body paragraphs? So there's three main things. Avoid over-summarizing the sources because, again, this is a synthesis, not a summary. Include only the information necessary to explain how a source connects to the specific theme you're discussing. And keep your own voice. Although you're weaving together different authors' words, your own ideas and observations should definitely begin and end each paragraph, okay? And part of keeping your own voice is making sure that you're not using huge quotation marks. So that's why on the previous slide, I emphasized short quotations, all right? And then finally, you want to use appropriate transition words and active verbs. Transition words are extremely important here because they will show me how exactly do authors connect. And your active verbs show me that you're taking the time to write professionally. You're not using those lazy verbs, as I call them. And I've given you some examples. So for your active verbs, you want to say things like discusses or highlights, asserts. Then if you Google examples of active verbs, you'll find plenty of other ones. You don't want to say things like says, states, or talks about. Mr. Thierry also doesn't like mentions, goes on to say, all those things that really don't tell me exactly what the author is doing with that piece of information. So that's why you want to use an active verb, okay? So here's an example. I'm not going to read through it, but I've posted this Google slideshow to to Blackboard under the Research and Literature Content folder. That way you can go back and digest the information at your own pace. And because information literacy is huge, I've gotten it from this resource. So if you want to see what this paragraph looks like in the context of the original, you can click this link and it'll bring you right to it. Alrighty? So I'm sure you're all like, okay, we get it, like whatever, let's just move on. So say you've got at least your 4 body paragraphs, because remember, you're going to be talking about 4 common themes. How do you end it? Well, although this literature review is a standalone document, and as I said before, it typically might just be one section of a longer essay, the conclusion should still indicate how the research you've done relates to the research questions you plan to pursue in your argumentative essays, or how your understanding of the topic has increased or changed. You want to try to avoid using I in your conclusion as much as possible, although there are times that it might be appropriate. For example, if you really can't figure out a way to say that the research questions you've chosen are X, Y, and Z without using I, then that's acceptable. But you might want to say something like, further exploration of this topic will take the form of these research questions. You put a colon, and then you would list your research questions. And it sounds a little wordy, but at least it avoids using I. And that's really the key here. So at the end of the day, you're going to have one introductory paragraph where you are allowed to use I, 4 body paragraphs where you're going to talk about your 4 common themes among your sources. Each paragraph should explain at least 3 sources and how they connect to that common theme. And then at the end, you'll have one conclusion paragraph that does all the things that you're seeing on the screen in front of you right now and that you're going to avoid using I. Alrighty? So that's the literature review. We'll talk a little bit more about it in class when I see all of you on Wednesday. But for right now, your first step is really completing that literature review synthesis matrix that I'm going to talk about in the next video. All right? So stay tuned. I'll talk to all of you soon, and bye.